Good evening, everyone. I would love to thank Coffee Bandits for their coffee tasting bar and the refreshments they brought for us tonight. Those were awesome. Do we have any students here from Merced College or UC Merced? Fabulous. Thank you for coming out. I'm Gail Benedict, producing manager for Arts UC Merced Presents, and our artistic director is Dunya Ramakova, who's in the back row over there. Is she there? Hi, Dunya. Oh, she does that to me every time. We both welcome you. There she is. Hi, Dunya. We both welcome you to the beautiful Merced County Arts Council's Multicultural Arts Center. And we're so happy that they're hosting this event for us. And many thanks to their staff, the executive director, Laura Phillips, the director of operations, Joey Essick, and the board president, Martha Acevedo. Thank you, Martha. We are grateful to bring our 6th season here for Arts UC Merced Presents, and to bring this renowned artist from Los Angeles, Gronk Nicandro. Many wonderful things have happened during the first 2 weeks, and there is more to come. Gronk's assistant, Luis Roberto Vasquez, is here. You can see his work in the gallery. Luis had his first solo show at the UC Merced Art Gallery that will be there until the end of next week. I'll say what? Oh, he'll be here until October 27th. So they negotiated a deal. Good. That's good. Held over. And we're sold out tonight, so this is amazing. These events have been possible because of the great collaboration between Arts UC Merced Presents, the Merced Multicultural Arts Center, the UC Merced Art Gallery, a UC Merced faculty, and Merced's Art Hop. Dunya and I want to thank the following people who have been a part of this. Assistant Professor Mario Cifuentes, James Ortez, Assistant Dean for Social Sciences, Humanities, and Arts at UC Merced, Art Lecture and Gallery, UC Merced Art Gallery Manager, Tonya Lopez Craig, and the students from her curator class, Art Lecture Karen Lecoq, Art Lecture Richard Gomez, UC Merced students from Club Mecha, artist Oscar Torres, artist Ruben Sanchez, who has curated the Day of the Dead exhibit upstairs there, Kimberly Zamora and Kevin Hammond from the Merced Art Hop. We are here this evening to discuss Chicano art within the context of the contemporary global art scene. The discussion will be prefaced with presentations by Dr. Kenichi Yoshida, who is Assistant Professor of Art History from UC Merced's Global Art Studies program, and Dr. Ramon Garcia, Professor of Literature from CSU Northridge. Dr. Kenichi will start out our lecture. It is titled Remapping the Avant-Garde Geopolitical Foreclosure of Figurative Painting in Japan. Ken?
I'd like to thank Professor Ramikova for inviting me to give a talk tonight, and Gail Benedict for putting everything together so perfectly. And Louis, thank you for your painting, and Gronk for being here. Okay, so let's give it up for everybody. So I want to preface my talk by saying that this is not going to be about Gronk, which may be disappointing for some of you guys, and it was kind of disappointing for me as well. My field is in post-war Japanese avant-garde, and I was trying to make a connection between Tokyo in the 1950s and the 1960s and LA in the 1960s and the 70s when Gronk was doing his work. And to my dismay, I couldn't make any connection. LA obviously is on the West Coast, Tokyo is in the Pacific. You've seen that the connection is pretty self-explanatory, but that never happened during those decades. And this talk is going to be about why that never happened. Okay. My talk is about a specific moment in post-war Japanese avant-garde art history that Gronk has allowed me to imagine for the first time. I say imagine because when I tried to bring Gronk to post-war Japanese art and post-war Japanese art to Gronk, realized that an alternative history would have to be invented. Of course, Gronk's work with thought of the Japanese avant-garde in the 1960s and the 1970s is fairly easy to do. One can immediately see the parallels between Gronk's work and Japanese avant-garde art. Gronk formed ASCO in 1972 with Harry Gamboa Jr., Patsy Valdez, Willie F. Heron III, and the group performed multiple happenings throughout East LA, including walking mural here and instant mural, and my personal favorite, First Supper in 1972. Tokyo was no stranger to performance art either. There were groups such as Hybrid Center and Zero Dimension that took to the streets. That's the group called Hybrid Center. It's a collective of 3 artists. They just went around the city of Tokyo in 1964 and just cleaned everything. You see them cleaning the streets, fire hydrant, and you see the sign that says "Be Clean." That was one of their performance art. And you see a member of Hybrid Center, Nakanishi Natsuyuki. His face is painted white, and he made this compact object, and he just brought it onto a train and just licked it, the entire performance piece. Okay. And here's a piece by Zero Dimension called Buck Naked as World Ritual. I guess I don't have to say that, but done in 1964. As you can see, these naked guys are lying down in front of a sacred shrine in Tokyo. These instances were, in varying degrees, attempts to go outside of museums or galleries to involve unpredictable urban interactions and to reveal the ideological implications of space. However, looking for formal resemblances would require that we accept the mediating notion of art to momentarily equalize these two separate spaces, the homogenizing procedure of which is precisely the problem that gets in the way of creating a more interesting link between Gronk and the Japanese avant-garde. Comparative method presupposes translatability of notions, which is typically set by the center and reinforced through a series of articles, books, professors, and academic departments. To avoid taking that route, I have to wade through a messier network of transcultural negotiations in search for tangible connections and encounters between these two art historical moments. However, it is difficult to get to Los Angeles from Tokyo if your mode of transportation is post-war Japanese avant-garde, because links simply were not made back then. But this does not mean that we have to fall back on the comparative method. Refusing to compare reveals an interesting question. Why didn't Japanese avant-garde artists or critics, despite their international mobility in the 1960s and the 1970s, encounter Gronk or Chicano art in LA? Or to pose the question differently, what could have facilitated this encounter? These questions gain in significance only if that potential existed in the first place, and I'd like to argue today that there were indeed opportunities for Japanese artists to encounter Chicano art in Los Angeles, but that possibility was unfortunately foreclosed. Around mid to late 1950s, the shifting cartographic imagination of the globe affected post-war Japanese art and made the American West Coast nearly invisible. And the aim of this talk is to discuss why and how this happened. Reversing that shift to reveal the lost secret passage to LA from post-war Tokyo will require us to posit a radically different world. And to do so, we have to first look at the role Mexico played in revitalizing the Japanese avant-garde of the 1950s. Okay. In 1955, Modern Art Museum of Tokyo held a Mexican art exhibition, which garnered a lot of attention. This huge undertaking involved not only the governments of the two nations, but also elicited the support of major players in art criticism, painting, photography, design, and architecture. The venue was especially exciting for those artists and critics who were finally given the opportunity to see the paintings and lithographs of Diego Rivera, Rufino Tamayo, Jose Clemente Orozco, Jose Guadalupe Posada, and Davido Alfaro Siqueiros. The exhibition also boasted many ancient and pre-Columbian artifacts, the fact of which might make some of us kind of uneasy today, but intellectuals at the time found this cultural arrangement to be quite meaningful. One pressing concern among leftist Japanese intellectuals at the time was how to fuse the traditional or the indigenous to contemporary politics by reclaiming minor cultures and communities destroyed or effaced during the modernization period. Examining present contradictions crystallized and signified loose and incoherent desires of the past, the process through which new and different futures became imaginable. And they believed that art had the capacity to articulate these different temporal spaces. Japanese observers found in Mexican painters' ability to graft pre-Columbian and indigenous motifs to contemporary politics a great example of cultural and political totality that was missing in Japanese avant-garde painting. As incredible as they are, paintings produced in Japan kept the contemporary subject matter and failed to register the forgotten desires of past communities. Here's one example of what some of the critics were complaining about. And if we look at these Mexican paintings, it is quite easy to see the role continuity played in articulating indigenous, local, and universal politics. The artist Okamoto Taro was so impressed that he tried to bring quote-unquote primitive motifs found in Japanese artifacts to ancient Maya and Aztec art in an effort to imagine a minor transnationalism. As you can see, that's an ancient artifact from China, that's from Japan, and that's from, I think, Aztec culture. But you can see Okamoto is trying to draw a connection between quote-unquote primitive Japanese motifs and artifacts found in Latin America. And he would eventually make his way toward Mexico City and make a giant mural of his own in 1969. That's what he made in 1969. It was lost. Someone lost the wall. And they eventually recovered it, and it's now sitting in Shinjuku Station in Tokyo. And in 1970, he also made this giant tower, which is also reminiscent of some of the Mexican motifs that he found during his travels there. Many critics and artists were convinced that working through Mexican art would revitalize the effort to politicize art. But there were, of course, competing views. Younger artists were a bit more skeptical of this prospect. The painter Ikeda Tatsuo was impressed by the collection, but felt that the works emphasized cultural tradition and identity too much. Echoing a similar sentiment was Kawara On, who identified with the politics but could not get beyond indigenous and local motifs that interfered with the intended message. Kawara's dismissal was not so much targeted at the Mexican painters, but directed more at how they were received in Japan. The Mexican-ness praised in Siqueiros or Orozco dangerously flirted with mysticism and exoticism, and the old left's understanding of Mexico continued to claim the country as a heroic space external to the United States. Kawara's reaction was to conceive Mexico not as an external space from which to challenge American dominance, but to understand it as a site more internal to the larger American politics that needed to be destabilized from within, which also meant that Japan would have to be more openly mapped as an American colony. And you have to understand that Japan was occupied by the United States until 1952. Okay. Kawara's critique of Mexican art was then tantamount to challenging the left for their topographical misconception. Kawara's Black Soldier was one example of his complex intervention into the debate. As one can see in the image, the extreme foreshortening references Siqueiros' self-portrait as well as Victim of Fascism, both of which were exhibited in Tokyo in 1955. The foreshortening in self-portrait creates solidarity and continuity, as the image of Siqueiros reaches out to beseech his audience to join the struggle. The body of the artist assumes the role of grounding perspective as he fights off the darkness to stave off complete dissolution. In Victim of Fascism, a similar sense of urgency is felt as the scarred back of a man functions as a fleshy ground on which the history and atrocity of violence is inscribed. The muscular body holds together two separate objects through pain and suffering. But no such continuity is evident in Kawara. Instead of continuity, we see discontinuity. Instead of the soldier's face, we see the sole of his shoes. The body is barely held together, and the extreme foreshortening operates to fragment rather than to unify. The figure does not approach us, but falls away from us. It could even be interpreted that he is standing on the surface of the canvas, further complicating the spatial orientation of the composition with regard to the spectator's viewing position. In comparison to earlier figurative paintings that clearly marked the oppressed as the Japanese, and these are some of the examples that are clearly drawn from the perspective of the Japanese as the oppressed, right? You see yellow stool, that signifies Japanese prostitutes. That stands in for American soldiers and Japan. Kawada's composition places a black soldier as the site of struggle to trouble the spatial demarcation. African Americans in Japan were a complex signifier. On one hand, they were part of the occupation force, but on the other hand, they were also subject to racism and inequality in the United States, which was a point of identification for many Japanese. In other words, the figure is a sign of included exclusion. The title clearly indicates that the man is African American, but if we take a look at the painting closely, his race is somewhat ambiguous. The thighs appear to be exposed, but that could very well be the color of his pants given the chromatic proximity to what is likely his shirt. The ethnicity remains open to interpretation. So, assuming an external space was far less effective a strategy than staking out an imminent position within the empire. And one of the tragic misinterpretations of the Mexican exhibition was that many observers were encouraged to view these works strictly as Mexican works and not as processes of negotiating the influence of the United States. Even though Siqueiros criticized racism and treatment of laborers in the United States, Japanese Marxists insisted on placing Mexico closer to the Soviet Union and Paris, and not against its northern neighbor, meaning the north-south or south-north traffic was obscured by the ideological movement of east-west, which was also the spatial orientation through which Japan understood its relationship with the United States and Europe. This cartographic and geographic misinterpretation foreclosed the potential south-north passage, which I think Kawada, through his ambivalent embrace of Siqueiros, tried to disclose as a critical axis to the United States. I would like to speculate here and say that had there been more time to explore this possibility, the Japanese avant-garde might have furthered their art through Mexico and could have eventually ended up in California. But there simply wasn't enough time to do this. Why? Something else occurred around this time, which snuffed out the promise of Mexican art. Throughout the 1950s, there were two dominant styles in art that vied for dominance, which were abstraction and figuration. Mexican art exhibition in 1955 was one of the more powerful arguments in favor of representational art, but what was supposed to be a new direction in figurative painting proved to be a beginning of the end when a slew of abstract paintings were exhibited in 1956. This is known in Japanese art history as the informel shock. Informel is formless in French, that transformed the local art world practically overnight. This was followed by the art critic and dealer Michel Tapier's visit to Tokyo in 1957, along with three abstract expressionists, George Matthew, Sam Francis, and Imai Toshimitsu. And just to give you guys an idea of what they were, so away from representational paintings, you have abstraction really coming in strong. And here's George Matthew performing in a kimono in Osaka. Very offensive, but they loved it back then. So this was followed by a figural painting that was closely aligned with the leftist politics and supported in part by the Japanese Communist Party, was deemed irrelevant as critics and artists flocked to abstract expressionism that was quickly exalted as the universal language of art. By the end of 1957, multiple narratives of art were reduced to one single Euro-American trajectory. But before we blame the French for delivering post-war Japanese avant-garde to American abstraction, we have to consider multiple factors at play. The political situation in Japan was still quite fluid in 1955 and 56. The Korean War at the beginning of the decade and American engagement in Vietnam led to many political demonstrations in Tokyo, but that also proved to be quite lucrative for the Japanese government. The government was so confident of the nation's economic future that in 1956, it declared that the poverty-stricken post-war era was now over. That year also marked the downfall of the Japanese Communist Party. It had been struggling to maintain influence since the early 1950s, but its failure to adequately respond to the Hungarian uprising that the Soviet Union violently suppressed forced many of its members to leave the party. There's one more thing. In 1955 and 1956, or in the 1950s in general, Japan was also asked to more closely align its economic policies with the United States that wanted to move aggressively toward fossil fuel. Revising the energy plan had a devastating effect on the coal-dependent economy of southern Japan, but greatly benefited the central government. Put simply, the 1950s was a decade in which Japan was slowly but surely being integrated into the military and industrial complex of the American Cold War strategic plan. This geopolitical consolidation of the democratic West against the communist East significantly affected the imaginary composition of the globe. Or just to give you an example, I forgot to give you guys this image of, so this is some of the works that Japanese art scene was beginning to see immediately after Tapie's visit in 1957. Japan's attention quickly turned to action painting in New York. Jackson Pollock's strip painting became extremely popular, followed by the Neo-Dada art of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. As Mexico began to fade, New York was crowned the center of the art world and became the point of entry into the United States for many Japanese artists. Kawada did go to Mexico in 1958, but left for Paris only a few months later, and finally ended up in New York, where he became one of the most influential conceptual artists of the 20th century. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with his date paintings. He just passed away a few months ago. And when the Japanese art critic Tono Yoshiaki finally got his passport in the late 1950s, he first flew to New York, and then to Paris and to Rome. And as though out of old habit, he ended up in Mexico, but his spatial disorientation was quite palpable. Using the newer map of contemporary art, it made little sense for him to be there, and sadly, he failed to seriously engage the local art scene. By 1958 or 59, Mexico was only an empty space beyond the American desert of Arizona and Nevada, and Los Angeles was some quirky town on the other side of the American continent. The only thing that interested Tono in LA was the Watts Towers, which he obviously saw as a strange reiteration of what he experienced in New York and not as an expression of that particular neighborhood. This is one reason why western coast of the US as an extension of Mexico was foreclosed for Japanese contemporary art. The dominance of abstraction was not entirely negative. It gave artists a chance to abandon and move away from painting that had been so bound up with humanistic discourse of expression and representation. But to go back to the initial question that I posed at the beginning of this talk, for Japanese artists to have used figurative painting to approach contemporary art, the political left needed a more creative means to overcome Soviet influence. A greater self-determination for Japan had to have been achieved, and a long-term critical program against the remnants of Japanese imperial colonialism had to have been devised. I believe these are some of the promises that were bound up with Mexican art. And had Mexico remained a strong center of art for the Japanese, many more avant-gardes would have ended up there, and some of them might have crossed the border into California with a more critical insight into poverty and racism. And they would have encountered ASCO performing their happenings in East Los Angeles and recognized them as their American counterpart. Thank you. So just to give you guys a visual representation, I forgot to do this, of what the world kind of looked like in 1955. So you have Mexico City competing pretty competently with New York and Paris, or at least from the perspective of Tokyo, right? Only 3 years later, you have New York pretty much dominating the scene. As you can see, Mexico City was pretty diminished by then, right? Obviously, that's not the world map that Japanese artists look at today. And, it's much more egalitarian, I suppose. And if everything goes well, in 6 years, we should have Merced figured in, right there. So, thank you.
I like that 2020 part. Thank you, Dr. Yoshida. Our next speaker, Dr. Ramon Garcia, has a PhD in literature from UC San Diego. He is the author of a book of poetry called Other Countries and Ricardo Valverde, a book on the artist Ricardo Valverde, which was a finalist for 3 International Latino Book Awards. He has a forthcoming book of poetry, The Chronicles, that will be published by Red Hen Press in April 2015. Garcia has published poetry and criticism in a variety of journals, museum catalogs, anthologies, and scholarly edited books. He is a member of the American Studies Association, the College Art Association, and the Society of Literary Scholars. Critics and writers, sorry. That was a weird pause, sorry. He has published work on artists such as Gronk, Asco, Patsy Valdez, and Harry Gamboa, Jr. He is a professor in the Chicano Studies Department at California State University, Northridge. Please welcome Dr. Ramon Garcia.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to thank Dunya Ramikova and Gail Benedict and everyone at the Merced Multicultural Center for inviting me to be here. I'm very honored and happy to be here because I'm from Modesto and I've never done anything so close to home. So it's a very special occasion for me. My talk is an introduction to Gronk's work, and it's very selective. It is in no way comprehensive or in-depth, simply because Gronk has decades of work. It's all very diverse, and he's worked in every possible medium. So I'm going to just introduce some of what I think is interesting body of work. There's going to be big gaps. I mean, there's a lot more where this comes from, and this is because we're limited with time. But this is a portrait of Gronk by Ricardo Valverde, who is a photographer that I wrote my last book on, and this is from fashion shows they used to do in the 80s with especially an artist named Diane Gamboa. She made paper fashions, and people that were kind of ephemeral, and they photographed them, they documented them, etc. This is from what interviews that I did. These were, I think, for anti-nuclear sort of fund. There's some activism behind some of these, not all of them. Gronk even did murals, which are, of course, not an avant-garde form necessarily, although this one kind of looks avant-garde because Gronk was involved with it, even though it was a collaboration. The murals, of course, in the early 1970s, very influenced by the Mexican muralists that Ken mentioned, were the predominant form of Chicano art. But the ASCO group that formed at that time, they were only interested in it as an ironic kind of way, as you will see. And through the performance, perhaps, of making the mural a sort of performance instead of the traditional form of the mural. This is Gronk in character, named Popcorn, sometimes Pontius Pilate. And in some of these, I'm going to focus so you can see the sources and the the sources that Gronk used in his work, and also where his ideas came from. Like any accomplished, significant artist, Gronk pulls ideas from many different sources. They don't necessarily, of course, have national boundaries. And he's always changing. And I think this is another indication of an accomplished artist. They don't write the same poem, for example, if they're a poet. They don't do the same kind of work. They're always changing, experimenting, and doing different bodies of work. And throughout the decades, we can kind of trace this very definitively in Gronk's work. In, for example, this performance, the character of Popcorn comes from a film, Les Enfants du Paradis, The Children of Paradise, which is a French classic from the 50s, from the 40s. And this particular character, who's kind of a mime of sorts in the film, influenced that character. It's a sort of an East LA version of this mime. A body of work that I think is very interesting of Gronk's is from the early 70s when he was doing a lot of photography. These images, this photographic work was not exhibited until very recently, actually. It was featured in a big exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, but that was the first, or one of the first times that these photographs have been exhibited. Some of them are documentary in form, others are kind of from the, sort of related to the No Movies and the ASCO performances. Of course, Ken mentioned ASCO. And this group, although it was only existence a few years, was significant because they were doing work that no one in LA at that time was doing. There were some performances, happenings, etc., but very few of them actually took it to the streets, and to the streets of East LA. And Patsy Valdez, Gronk, Willie Heron, Harry Gamboa Jr., they would do these performances in the streets of East Los Angeles during a very sort of time that was very, there was a lot of upheaval with the Vietnam War and with the political movements, with the police, etc. And their audiences, of course, would be, the abuelitas going to the store and the lowriders and all the, and so they'd look at them and they would say, "Que asco," which means, of course, how disgusting, like nausea, right? And I think that's great. The way I look at it is, to me, they were taking sort of Artaud's theater of cruelty, where he originally intended it to be, which is to shock people out of their complacency. Now, very few groups in the theater world were able to do that, even though they attempted to do that. None of them really worked, because you can't shock people that go inside a theater, and they're certainly not going to be feeling nauseous as the theater of cruelty intended it to do. But ASCO did, and they were, I think, very successful at it. They liked the name, the reaction that they got, and that's why they adopted it for the collective, for the group. They sort of marked the museum, the LACMA, with their names, and this became one of their signature performances. Later on, just a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, the museum, LACMA, where this was considered obviously vandalism and quickly erased it, actually featured this in the museum. So there's an irony of its time. They did this because Harry Gamboa Jr. went and talked to one of the curators, and he asked him, "Why don't you have any Chicano or Latino or even Mexican artists in your collection when the city is, full of Mexicans?" And the curator said, "Well, they don't do real art. They only do folklore and They do folkloric stuff and big murals we can't fit in here. So it was very condescending. But of course, that has changed only because now we have Chicano and Latino curators who are now in powers of position, or else there would be people feeling entitled to make comments like that still. I think that's the reality. This is another ASCO performance in the streets of LA in Whittier Boulevard, which is now Cesar Chavez, I think, is it? No, oh no, that was Brooklyn, okay. I'm not obviously from LA, as you know. This is an interesting performance also by ASCO. I think this is Harry Gamboa, if I remember correctly. And they taped Patsy to the wall and called it a mural. It didn't last very long. They just filmed it in Super 8. This, of course, was more controversial and subversive than it seemed, because this is, you have to remember, the height of first wave feminism, and to be dressing like Patsy, let's just say they called her other things besides ASCO, so it's very bold of her to dress like that. Now today you look at that and say, well, it's sexy, everyone's supposed to be sexy, but at this time that concept was very contested, and she got the brunt of that. Actually took a lot of courage to do this. And in my conversations to an art historian, a senior art historian in Latin American art, she didn't like this performance because she thought that Patsy was objectifying herself. But I disagree with that, because no one forced her to do that. She actually had a lot of fun doing this. This is another ASCO performance in which they informed the local news audience that was always reporting on the horrible things of East LA, only the negative things, and that nothing has changed, right? But they convinced them that there was a gang murder, and there goes the police or the news station to report it. And it was featured on the 8 o'clock news or whatever, but it was all fake. It was all a performance which they documented at the time, and in fact this image made the cover of Art in America 2 years ago. Another irony of time. The ASCO group made these performances, which they called a no movie, because they didn't have enough money to create real movies, and so they just took film stills. Like in the Hollywood studios, they would take film stills as they were shooting the film of the stars, etc. So they documented the filming of the big movies in the studios, but they did this in their garages in East LA. But they would call them no movies. So they were film stills for films that never were actually made. So they were fake film stills, in other words. But they were very convincing because they look like movie stills. And then they had an Oscar night, which was not Oscar night, it was a no movie night, and they would give each other awards. That's their version of the Oscar. That's the no movie award, which is actually a cobra, like one of those big souvenirs from Tijuana, which they spray painted gold. This was actually also featured in museums everywhere from LA to France this past couple of years. The No Movie Award has been making its rounds finally into the museums. This is a drawing of Gronk's, and here what I want to point out is, even though it's beautiful, it looks very accessible, because it is, there's a lot going on here in terms of the ideas that where this image came from. Here you have Saint Sebastian, a very common icon of Renaissance art and modern art also. The Minotaur from Greek mythology, which is very significant to surrealism and to modern art. And you sort of combine them and make them look very contemporary. One of the most important sources of ideas for Gronk's work is from film, from the movies, from everything from Japanese avant-garde film and modern films to bad B movies, such as Devil Girl from Mars, which is one of Gronk's favorite movies that has influenced a lot of his more pop-inspired work. This is a movie that is very difficult to get through, I think. It's very bad, but it's also very fun. It's about some devil girl from Mars that comes to take over the world or something. So, although it's not a critically acclaimed movie, it's one that Gronk has used for his work in a serious way, because it's, he kind of transformed the ideas behind it. It bears some saying, though, that Gronk obviously likes good films too, and he has watched everything. He's like a walking encyclopedia of film. I can ask him about any film ever made from many countries, and he will know, and he'll let me know whether I like him or not. One of the icons that Gronk has transformed has been this now very little known Mexican film actress, Ninon Sevilla, one of the stars of the cabaretera genre of films from the 40s and 50s in Mexico. And in fact, a series of paintings were based a few years ago that are abstract, were based on cabaretera films, especially those of Ninon Sevilla. And here you have Ninon Sevilla in one of her films, Aventurera, and then here's a poster from the French version of, well, the French movie poster of the film Aventurera. Tormenta is a character that appears in a lot of Gronk's paintings. He also did an opera based on this character. And this is a very cinematic image of iconic sort of woman that never shows her face. So all her identity is based on her backside. And so she's kind of a sphinx. And she has she has an identity, but it's all based on the surface of who she is. So in that sense, she's kind of a mystery and an enigma. And it's also slightly surreal. But one of the sources for this image, for this character, because that's actually what she is in the end, because she reappears in a lot of his work, is the women from classic Hollywood films, such as Notorious, Ingrid Bergman's walk up the stairs with a key. Here's Hitchcock filming Ingrid Bergman in the film. But there's a lot of women in the classic films that have this sort of signature sort of look and identity, and they're equally identified by what they wear as their faces. So in traditional art, or through the history of art, we tend to think that the face is, of course, the portrait, but in this case, Gronk made the backside the portrait. So there's a kind of a reversal there. Here's a kind of surrealist version of Tormenta. There's even some works on napkins in which Tormenta makes an appearance. Gronk has also worked on very large-scale paintings and set designs, especially for the very prominent director Peter Sellers. Here is Gronk, and you can get this sense of the scale of this and the labor that it takes to produce something like this. Gronk is very prolific, obviously. Here's a set for another opera. This is the cover for the CD of Aina Damar. Aina Damar is this opera here. His paintings have also been on the cover of books. This is a book by Lynn Thompson, a poet from LA. My own book also has a very nice cover. This is a print of Gronk's from 2010. A lot of Gronk's more recent work is abstract, and that, it's not surprising. He tends to change, like I said, like any significant artist. And there are ideas behind this also, such as these very current paintings that are, sort of based on pyramids, on Mayan motifs. They're abstract work. In fact, they're on exhibit right now at the Laurier Sessions gallery in Santa Monica. There's a sort of layering of the surface of the canvas. In the color scheme is very Mayan. It looks like ruins almost, and yet it's obviously very contemporary. And that's because Gronk lives in downtown Los Angeles, and the architecture and the landscape of that part of the city, which is very urban, and in fact, a historian from LA says that Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, looks like Mexico City 10, 20 years ago. So while what it's being transformed, in the architecture and the landscape, it's layered with all the different changes. So if you look very closely at the walls and the landscape of downtown, it is like a ruin, like a modern ruin, because you can still see traces of what used to be there before in the signage, in the architecture. So it's always a kind of ruin in process. And I think this is what you see in the recent paintings of Gronk, some of which are where they are here in the gallery space. And also there are some photographs from the earlier work also on this side of this store. In this store, so you get a sort of range of Gronk's work, and that's all I had. I meant this as an introduction, and I think now we're going to sit up here and have a conversation with Gronk, and then we're going to open it up for your questions. So, thank you. Well, I wanted to begin just by asking Gronk if you could comment on, considering Ken's presentation, on the Japanese films or filmmakers that have sort of played a role in his work, if there are any that have sort of generated his own ideas, and how that kind of works, from being from Los Angeles and then going to Japanese film.
Okay. I'm from East Los Angeles, and I think of my contribution in some way is East meets East instead of East meets West. So what I do is, like Ramon says, watch a lot of film. And one of my favorite directors in the world is a man called Ozu. He's a Japanese filmmaker. He made films in the 30s, the 40s, and 50s. And I think for me, it was inspiring because he placed some limitations on his film technique. And a lot of times people think, oh my God, that's so boring. Camera is very low, it's looking up as if you're in a household in Japan. But for me, that was inspiring. It was, for me, a cue to go about doing things in a very almost low-budget way. I enjoy that I can select and pick things and just eliminate the excess of things. When you come into the cultural center here, usually during the day, I have a cart. And in the cart are my brushes, the paints. Some of the paints are from Home Depot. I want you to know that. It's part of the process of creation. I want you to know by looking at my cart and the brushes inside of a plastic cup or a plastic container, they're 99-cent brushes from any kind of store that sells the 99-cent brushes. So I have a fondness for finding things in the daily experience of any community. I was in Madison, Wisconsin. And in Madison, Wisconsin, I, again, placed my cart there so people can investigate what I do. But the museum director called me up and said, could you go on this radio show at 5 in the morning? And I thought, who the hell listens to radio at 5 in the morning? They go, Gronk, we've got a lot of farmers. This is the cheese capital. They listen to this show. Could you please go on? I said, sure. My job is whenever I travel to make myself available for everything. So I went on the radio and I was describing what I was doing at the museum. And I was saying, you know, I'm doing a landscape, but it's the landscape of the inside of the land. Seeds, roots, trees, germinating, things taking place underground. And that the earth has had a big impact on the direction of my work. The earthquake, the Northridge earthquake, there's a huge big crack that goes up the side of the wall of where my kitchen area is in my studio. And things came crashing down and glass broke and windows broke. It was just, when I was on the radio, I was describing it like Orson Welles did War of the Worlds. It was just this fantastic tale. Well, a farmer, his wife and 6 kids, after hearing my explanation, came to the museum. And he was so excited. He goes, oh, I wanted to meet you because I heard you on the radio. And you know about them earthquakes in Los Angeles? You know what we got here? We got tornadoes. And everything you were saying happens to us, but we're underground. And so, you know, all the crashing of the glass, and we hear all of that. So here's Mr. Urban Los Angeles talking to Farmer John about how the earth has an impact on our lives. To me, that was an exciting thing because right after he left, I started to paint these swirling shapes that went through my work. So it was kind of the daily had an impact on the direction of what I was going to do. It was this random conversation. And for me, that's the important part and reasoning, I think, for a lot of things that happen. It could be something that most people would disregard and think unimportant. Those are the things I gravitate to. And in Japanese film, I mean, there's a set designer and artist from the 1950s and early 60s who I met at a film festival, and he did the set for Double Suicide, which is one of a pivotal film in Japan's history of cinema. But his early performance pieces, he would put on gloves and set a piano on fire by the beach, and the concert would be just him playing as the fire continues to eat the piano. So again, there's kind of, I think, crossover for me. That's a performance piece from the early 60s that he did. And so I think I've been inspired by so many things. And Ramon pointed out Devil Girl from Mars. That also had an impact. I think I saw that when I was a kid on television one day. And there was a boomerang coffee table in my front living room. I used to sit on it because I would think of it as my flying saucer. And I would watch these sci-fi movies or different types of film that would come on. And this one was, I just couldn't believe it. You know, you're 7, 8 years old. Somebody made this. That's what I want to do. I want to make things. So it planted the seed of becoming an artist. So it does have a significant connection to me. The other things that have taken place, like the movie that Ramon was saying, the Ninon Sevilla movies, well, she did this one called Perdida. And there is a magical musical number in there where she's on this pedestal of sorts, and she's wearing a Valkyrie outfit. There's wings on her head, but she's wearing a cha-cha dress. And all these men are dancing around her, and they're dressed like Supermen, but they're smaller than she is, and they're more enamored by their capes than they are about her. So all of that kind of absurdity, all of those little things that appear that for me are just minds to cultivate, to bring into my own work.
Was that a good enough explanation? You can see you're enthralled by it all. Ken?
I guess I'm kind of curious about how you choose your colors and some of the rituals surrounding your selection. If you could just talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to talk about this particular show. Now, one of the first pieces as you enter into the show is a poster, actually. The poster is of the opera, The Indian Queen. While I was researching that particular opera, it was about the conquest. And so the research involved looking at a lot of things Mayan, Aztec, fusing those images together, trying in an attempt to make them very contemporary. So that's the indication that the rest of the show is going to take on an operatic sensibility to it. When you walk past the first few pieces, one of them are two photographs. The two photographs are documentation of a time in the 70s where I took a photograph of Clifton's cafeteria, which was primarily for low-income people that were on fixed incomes. And it no longer is that. It's been transformed into a very trendy place now. The other photograph is of a movie house that used to be a movie house, then was transformed into a church, and now it's transformed into something else, a swank hotel. So I'm intrigued by that transformation, the constant thing of change. And the next pieces that you encounter are almost diary-like. They are my watercolors that I have been doing here in Merced at the local coffee shop where the coffee actually came from tonight. Every day I do one, and every day in Los Angeles I do one. I sometimes do it on the coffee cup. So it is, for me, diary-like. It is something that, again, the color palette is a lot of earth tone. And again, it's a children's watercolor set with a cheap little brush that comes inside of it. It's a cheap little pen that I use to do the outline to it. And if you look at the back, it's just a postcard, watercolor paper. So again, it's kind of I have like such a B-movie quality. I think of myself maybe as Roger Corman of the art world. I have that sense of wanting to record something that is just daily, that sometimes, we have that cup of coffee, but we totally disregard meaning or attachment to it. And for me, you find the divine in the daily, things that most people, again, would disregard and think unimportant. Those are the things I thrive on. Next, you'll see actual notes from the Indian Queen set ideas. So there's images of masks that I'm perhaps going to make, my color palette, earth tones, reds, browns. Then you have a series of pieces by my assistant and young intern, Louis, who has his work throughout it, the areas going upstairs. And for me, that was kind of an important decision, again, that improvisation of not knowing quite how the show is going to be like. or no final thought on it, that it was going to be improvised as it goes along. His contribution is his research for the Indian Queen. So he was going through the same type of research, but in a completely different way. He was using more figurative elements in his work, and then all of a sudden it transforms and changes when he develops a different style during a period of time. And then you have my large piece, which is actually a theater drop. Again, the cue came from the very beginning when you walked in, that it's theatrical. There's a theatrical quality. Somebody mentioned today about, are those jeans that are stitched together? No, it's usually a drop cloth, again, that you can buy at Home Depot and throw on the floor or over a car. And, but it's got these hooks into it, so it's used as a drop to go up and down in a theater setting. And it's a prison. And here in Merced, you have all these prisons, but I'm not only talking about the prisons that are local here, it could be your internal prison, or something that you want to escape from, but maybe what's on the other side is worse than what you have experienced now. So a lot of ifs in my work, a lot of questions about things. I usually tell people I don't have the answers to the world's problems, nor do I try to solve it in my work. I'm just an observer of a particular moment in time on this planet. This is a rock, it's going through space, and no one's driving it. So I'm leaving things behind, not only for my time period here, but also for hopefully for 300 years from now, a record of somebody thinking process. The final piece is my actual Merced piece, which is the colorful, large-scale piece that is going to be at the University of Merced. And so that stays behind. And for me, again, that is the process. It's over a course of time, something is actually made in real time. People can actually come in and watch and experience this piece. You don't have to stay for the entire time that I'm working, but you come in, you can take a look and see a mind at work, an artist actually working, because most people never think of an artist as a worker. For me, I'm here working hours, 11 to 6. So it's kind of, it plays with a lot of ideas like that. And the color palette on that one is particular to a lot of what I was doing in the set. So things that came out of the set are still coming out in the work, but also my observations of being here and walking around the neighborhoods and just being a participant and an observer and an outsider, actually, too, and seeing the unique beauty of a place. That, to me, is the important part of the ability of the artist to share. I think that's the bottom line of what any artist wants to do, is the ability to share with other people.
Thank you. I think we have to finish up soon, but we did want to open it up for questions from the audience. We hope that there are questions. It looks like there's a question back there. And,
I was curious, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. I was curious about the progression from being a muralist and into set work.
Uh-huh.
How did that happen? And then also, what do you like about that compared to painting? Is there a connection?
Okay. I was actually more conceptual, performance-driven work was my early pieces. You saw the Osco work, which was, we occupied, before occupied was a part of our word usage. We would occupy the streets and designate a place. This is where an instant mural is going to go. This is where a dinner party on a traffic island is going to go. And we have to eat a meal before the police come. So it was taking chances. One of the things about Osco was never to ask for permission for anything that we did. So we didn't ask for permission to tag the LA County Museum, but that was a political kind of content to that, because it was, as an artist signs his name to a work of art, well, we claim the entire museum as our work of art. So that was my early work. So it was always more conceptual, performance-driven. Making things with the hands was another important part of it. The black and white mural that you saw is kind of like, for me, a very traditional, but again, it's segments as if it's from a film. And I'm in there, and there's a painting of me in the mural, but there's also the character, the mime from Children of Paradise. And the history of Children of Paradise is that it was made during the German occupation in France. And they got through doing this subtly during a sense of occupation. Well, for me, growing up in East LA, we were occupied by the sheriffs and the police department. So it was kind of taking something that was about occupation and placing it in a contemporary setting. There was a vote taken by the community leaders because actually the police wanted us not to have a scene where people are being tear gassed in the painting. But the community said, let them do what they want to do. So we were able to keep that scene in the painting. And the thing about that particular work was I had never done a mural before. I was not somebody known as a painter. The fellow OSCA member, Willie, was known as the painter. So they asked him, and then Willie said, would you like to do a mural with me? So I ran home and looked up the word mural, and then came back and said, yeah, I can do it. So that was my first, public painting. The same thing happened years later, in 1985. The Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles asked if they could do a studio visit. And I said, yes. I live at the Grand Hotel in downtown LA on Spring Street. Now, the Grand Hotel was a transient hotel. It was a house of prostitution and drugs, and I thought it would be character building, so I moved in. The two curators came, and they were perfect examples of 1980s curators. The perfectly coiffed hair, the perfect posture. They were graduates of charm school. And they walk into this derelict place, dressed in their Chanel, just kind of everything very tasteful. And they go to the front desk and ask the man at the front desk, we've come to see Gronk. And the man at the front desk says to them, that'll be $5 each. Because in a house of prostitution, you have to pay the front desk in order to go up the elevator. When they arrive in my studio, they ask me, could you show us what you do? And I brought out one of my journals, which are kind of like those watercolors that you see here, which are a daily activity for me. And I showed them one, and they said, well, how many do you have? And they're those little black books that you do your drawings in. Well, I had, at the time, 250 of the books. So there were stacks of books. On a daily basis, I would do these drawings. Kind of like the Japanese artist who did a date for every single day, or postcards or whatever that he would do. And so they saw that and they said, thank you very much, and they left. I never thought anything was going to happen, but the next day I get a call from MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and they said, you've been picked as one of the 10 artists' new directions, and could you please come to the museum? We'd like to talk to you about what you might be doing here. So I went, and they said, you can do anything, you can do a survey of your work, whatever you want to do. And out of my mouth, for some reason, I don't know why, but I said, I want to do a painting the size of a football field, 300 feet by 30 feet high. And they looked at me and they said, how long is that going to take you? And for some reason, out of my mouth, because I had never done it before in my life, I said, 2 weeks. They said, what do you need? Which means drugs. No, I'm just kidding. Close to it. What do you need? And I said, a lot of coffee and a lot of donuts. They asked, where would you like your donuts from? Stupid me at the time said Winchell's, because it's open 24 hours. Mocha had money in that time, so I could have gotten from France if I wanted to. But I did the painting in 2 weeks, the size of a football field, and all of a sudden, a painter was born. People started calling me up to go to different cities. I didn't have to do a portfolio. I didn't have to go to galleries or anything. Galleries were coming to see the show at Mocha, and all of a sudden, I'm in galleries doing shows in different cities and different parts of the world. What happened was I get a call in the 90s when I was beginning to be disenchanted by museum and gallery shows. I just wanted out. What happens, I think, is that sometimes you're asked to do show after show after show, and for me, I felt my work was suffering because of that. I was just churning things out, and I did not want to do that. So I thought, where's an easy way out of this? Because I just want to drop my gallery in Paris. I want to drop my gallery in New York. I want to drop my gallery in LA. I just want to leave all of that. Most advisors that were advising me said, drop anything, but don't drop New York. If you drop New York, you're cutting your throat. So you're just beginning to get known, so don't. But New York was, for me, where the most whining voices on my answering machine would always come from. And they were always wanting everything, like it was impossible for me to do. So one day I get a phone call, and it's a theater company in Los Angeles. And they said, we're doing this play and we think you would be perfect to do a set design for it. And I had not done a set design. I'd done the OSCO things, but I'd never a theater set design. So they sent me the play, and it was the worst play I had ever read in my entire life. So of course I said, yes, I want to do this. Now, the play got horrible, horrible reviews, just deadly reviews. But the set, they sang the praises of the set. So set designer was born that day. So all of a sudden, a lot of other companies, the oldest Asian company in the United States called East West Players, calls up and said, can you do a play on Chairman Mao's wife? And I said, yes. And then another call, can you do a Japanese Hedda Gabler? I said, yes. Can you do Canton Jazz Club, which is about Forbidden City in San Francisco? And of course the answer was yes, because it was projects I never thought I would ever be involved with. And for me, the research is the exciting part of it. So one day I was at the Marte Perform in Los Angeles, and there was Peter Sellers directing a play called The Persians. And somebody said, would you like to go see one of his rehearsals? And I had known Peter's work for quite a long time. And I actually went to go see Nixon in China when it was at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. And Dunya did the costumes for that, if she's still here. And, she's asleep in the corner. Too much drinking out there. Just kidding. So I went to this opera. I left the theater just enthralled by what I had seen. And the audience was split. Either people loved it or they hated it. So there was a whole section that was booing and another section that was cheering. I was part of the cheering crowd. When I got to the parking lot with some friends, we were jumping up and down and saying, he's our age. He did this. It's like what our generation is going to be remembered for. Little did I know that he knew about me. And he gives me a call and says, would you like to do a play? And the play is Jean Genet's The Screens. And he said, are you familiar with The Screens? And I said, well, people consider it an unproducible play because it's so long and there's so many characters in it. And he goes, yeah, that's why I'm doing it. And so I said, well, you know, I'm familiar with Genet because during the earthquake, I explained to him about the earthquake that cracked up the side of the kitchen wall. And he goes, well, what is that about? And I said, well, since the earthquake, I've been referring to that crack on the wall as Genet's crack. Gronk, you're perfect for this. So I did the set for him. Then he called up and said, would you like to do a Stravinsky piece? And Esa-Pekka Solomon is going to be conducting it. It's going to be at the Dorothy Chandler. I said, yes. Then he called up, would you like to do an opera? It's going to be about Garcia Lorca, 1930s. I'm like, yes. Then he called up, would you like to do Griselda by Vivaldi? Yes. Then he called up, would you like to do The Indian Queen, which is going to be shown at Coffee Bandits next Thursday. The first example of the DVD is coming out soon, but you'll get an advance look at the production that we did, which originated in Perm, Russia, went to Madrid, Spain, and it's actually going to London next. And I'm working on the entire floor because it didn't have a floor, and it's going to be on canvas, and the dancers and, you know, chorus of 40 will be on the hand-painted floor. So I've made these jumps, but for me, I think I love the physicality of painting large. I like the small drawings because they're more intimate and sometimes even more personal. It's more diary-like for me. The bigger ones, you get to exhibit yourself because every brush, every stroke is there in the painting. So for me, that physicality still comes through. Any other questions? Yes. Yes.
What do you like about Merced?
What do I like about Merced? Everything. I think, you know, what makes up a place for me are the people that inhabit that place. I think that to me is probably what a city is, what a town is the people that inhabit it. And for, you know, being here for a short amount of time, I've got to experience people from, you know, different walks of life. And everybody's been open and, you know, just kind of sharing and giving. And so I think it's the people here that really has inspired me. And one of the pieces is staying here. It's going to be at the university, and that's the large, colorful piece. I mean, that's kind of, it's yours now. So.
Do you have one last burning question before we go? One more?
Hello. I have a question for you. For younger generations that are here, do you have any advice for them and as to how they can use art to expand their depth of knowledge?
Right. Well, it's something I probably wouldn't wish on anybody. You really have to be driven to want to take on the role of being an artist. It's like that folk tale, The Red Shoes. Once you put it on, you can't stop. You're constantly rehearsing, and doing it. And if you can live a life like that, then choose art. But there are other ways to see things. You can appreciate art, you can collect art, you can look at your city or your place that you live and see that art is around you 24 hours. I think, again, you know, for me, what I tell young students is that the divine is in the daily. It's what people don't think important, those are important things. And be the observer, be the person that looks at things, scrutinize things, be critical about things, but always be taking in. Because the more you take in, the more you're able to give back. And that's your job as what is called the artist. And it doesn't stop. I mean, it's a constant curiosity. I think, you know, sometimes when people hear that, you know, Devil Girl from Mars is one of my favorite movies, they, you know, kind of cringe because they have their A-list of films. And my A-list of films, I mean, I've been calling this other movie called The Giant Claw, My Citizen Kane. And most people would not agree with that. But, you know, I find a fondness for these people on that screen that are committed to believing in this big bird that looks horrible. So I think it's to instill imagination and curiosity in youth. I think that's kind of the more important part. But that you enrich your lives by being able to look and see things and experience things, even those things like the giant claw or Devil Girl from Mars, and mix that up with everything else that is possible. The film Perdida, Ninon Sevilla, the star of that particular film, and this is like 40s and 50s. Well, I actually met her on a flight one day. I was on a flight to the Telluride Film Festival, and all of a sudden I see a woman with a turban come into the plane, and I just thought that she has to be somebody. I mean, nobody wears a turban on a plane. And sure enough, I go to the festival, and she wins an award there, like for all of those films that she had made through her career. And this woman with a turban comes down. I'm like, oh my God, that's the woman from the flight. So I think again, it's these chance encounters. You make them wonderful, and you experience them, you know, and they become a part of your life. And that's what you share as an artist, and that's kind of my advice to a younger generation.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to offer that the Merced County Arts Council, if there are students here in the audience who would like a free membership, if you will fill out one of the forms at the desk and give it to me or Kathy Hansen, we'll make that possible for you.
Thank you.
Okay, so.
And what was the question, Alina?
Will Tormenta ever reveal her fate?
Okay, Tormenta. People always ask that question about Tormenta. The thing about Tormenta was originally, she was just a notation in one of my journals. It was a triangle, a circle, encased in a square. Now that's the building blocks of design, perhaps the universe. I'm just trying to figure out which one's causing all the chaos. Is the circle, the square, the triangle? But that was my notation in a notebook. Underneath I wrote, sometimes the back can reveal as much as what's up front in a person. Put it aside. Months later, go back to it. I'm like, what I like about this is that it's a mystery, that the Greeks had Medusa, Medea, Electra. Well, mine will be Tormenta. I will create my own American mythological character. She will cross over time, and that dress that Ingrid Bergman wore, well, it's a classic dress that a lot of women have, is that V-back black dress. Now, I took a cue from a Russian immigrant fashion designer in the 1920s and 30s. Her name was Valentina. Anybody know Valentina? Valentina said, never dress for this season, dress for the century. That means find something that crosses over time, that you can wear throughout your whole entire life. I liked that. So that dress that Tormenta has came from wanting something that had a timeless quality to it. Now, Tormenta also became a musical piece. A composer liked that image as well, and he wrote the Tormenta Cantata. The Tormenta Cantata was written for the Cronus String Quartet, there on one side of the stage, a soprano on the other side of the stage, dressed just like the painting of Tormenta, with her back to the audience. I'm in the middle with a wall like the one that's out there that's 12 feet by 8 feet, and I'm on stage in the middle with my brush that has a microphone attached to it. So you hear the brush going as I'm painting, but it is also the conductor baton, because the string quartet is following the tempo of the brush. So I had to learn how to paint to a metronome in order to keep the string quartet at a certain pace in the piece. So it's a written score. Some of them are just lines that go up and down because they know I'm going to be in a certain place on that stage and on that wall. So we're all following a music score. It's about 45 minutes in length, but the audience sees a painting emerge from a blank wall. So Tormenta comes, and then all of a sudden, you know, for a while I put it aside. She originally was going to come here to Merced. I had a painting, but it didn't fit in the truck that we were coming in, so I left it behind. But I can always do one. I have time. I've got another week.
Thank you all very much. What a fabulous audience you guys have.
Yes, thank you.
You have more opportunity to talk to Gronk. He will be here next week working on his painting Tuesday through Friday, 11 to 6. So please come in anytime and talk to him, ask questions that maybe you'll think of later after you leave tonight. He also talked about the showing of the movie, of the opera that they just did. It just went out of my head. I was nervous.
Indian Queen.
The Indian Queen will be shown at Coffee Bandits at 6 o'clock next Thursday.
And you can sleep through it
Yes.
if you like. You
This
can walk
is-
out on it. It's fine, because sometimes it's a Baroque opera, and sometimes modern audiences just are repelled by certain things of it. So you could watch one scene and leave.
Dunya said, yes, dozing is encouraged.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a long opera, but you know.
The opera is directed by the world-famous Peter Sellers. Gronk did the set design, and Dunya did the costume design, so you'll be able to see that there. And then finally, on Friday, Gronk's last day here at Merced is Merced Art Hop from 5 to 9 p.m. It is unknown what will happen at Art Hop.
And my assistant, Louis, is going to become a permanent resident of Merced, he says. Because he just loved the students he worked with.
So please come Saturday for Art Hop and see this unknown thing. It could be a happening, a painting. Maybe there will be duct taped people on the walls. We have no idea. Gronk does not even know yet. So we will see what happens on Saturday. Thank you for your patience, and thanks for coming to this wonderful event, and we appreciate it very much.